Hello everybody, this is Mr. McKeever, and today we're going to talk about Southeast Asia and the different struggles for democracy that exist in various places in that region. We're going to focus on 4 different areas in particular, places like the Philippines, Myanmar, Singapore, and Indonesia, and the struggles they face in incorporating new democracies into their region. Now, this is going to be a huge thing pretty much throughout any time after World War II, because after World War II, that imperialism that had once dominated the world is effectively going to be removed from the scene, and new countries are going to sprout up out of nowhere. And this is going to be the case in Southeast Asia, where in Southeast Asia, the Japanese had dominated this area throughout World War II, and now that they are gone, the nations in the area really wanted to push away from any kind of external influence having any sort of control over the country. The first place we're going to talk about is going to be the Philippines. This is going to begin mostly with the United States. The Philippines was actually at one point in time the United States territory, and we've talked about that before. And eventually they will gain their independence after World War II when the United States passes what we call the Bell Act. And this Bell Act is going to really kind of jumpstart the Philippine economy. We're going to give them $620 million, which in 1946 is a lot of money, in order to have free trade in the country. And this was going to be an opportunity for the Philippines to rebuild their economy after the Japanese had effectively tore it apart. But there was also some misgivings in the Philippines because of this. People started to get word that the Americans weren't going to leave because the Cold War picked up, and the Philippines are actually an extraordinarily strategic place. And we are going to look during the Cold War to actually have a permanent presence in Southeast Asia, and we're going to use the Philippines as that place, particularly Manila Bay, which is really the key piece of the Philippines. And this is going to create a bit of conflict in the Philippines because the Filipino people really just want to be left alone for the first time since the Spanish came over to their territories, 400 years ago. And they're going to rely on actually Japanese investment to rebuild their country. They didn't want any kind of ties to the United States at all. And in fact, they're going to really push towards eliminating any influence by the United States. But we just don't want to leave because this is really important to us. Not too far from the Philippines is this huge dominant communist power in China, and we don't want to give up any potential ability to respond to a Chinese threat. So this is going to lead to continual conflict and continual unrest in the Philippines. But it's not necessarily our problem because it's an independent country now. So let's talk about the first brand of leadership that comes out of the Philippines, and that's going to be a guy named Ferdinand Marcos, who from this picture looks like a really cool dude. He's smiling, he's happy, it's a very uplifting picture. But unfortunately, you are all sorts of wrong. Ferdinand Marcos is an absolutely awful dictator. He's elected in 1965. He's going to be caught doing something called money laundering. And to put it really simply, money laundering is when you take money that is corrupt, so money you're stealing, and you funnel it through a bunch of very legitimate businesses so that the money you get out of those businesses looks clean. So it's kind of like the mentality is that you're putting the money through the washing machine, and when it comes out, it's very clean. You're wiping away the crime and the dirt from it. Well, you don't actually put it through a washing machine. You put it through legitimate businesses, and he did this for millions upon millions of dollars that he stole from the Filipino people. Well, eventually, people will start to catch on what he is doing, and a guy by the name of Benigno Aquino Jr. is going to run against him during an election, and the people are so much a fan of Aquino Jr. that eventually Marcos is afraid that he's going to lose the election, so he has him killed. Well, despite the fact that Benigno Aquino is killed or assassinated through a unfortunate accident, quotation marks, unfortunate accident, his wife is actually going to run instead. A woman by the name of Corazon Aquino is going to run against Ferdinand Marcos and actually win an election against him, despite the fact that she has no political experience at all. But the people were so tired of Ferdinand Marcos, they're really willing to do anything. And this really is disheartening to Marcos. Doesn't really want to give up power, but eventually he has to, because the public support for Aquino is so overwhelming that he flees the country. And eventually he's going to be held accountable for stealing millions upon millions of dollars from the Philippines, but it takes a while to get a hold of the guy. Well, Aquino does a lot of good for the Philippines. She is going to reform the government. She actually does, which is, not always true that a politician promises something that actually carries through, but this time they do. And she also tries to deal with something called Moro separatists. An organization called the MNLF, the Moro Nationalist Liberation Front, is a group who want to break away from the Philippines. And they are in the small northern portion of the Philippines Islands. I'm going to flash back on this map right here so you can kind of see exactly where the Philippines it is. And it would be at this point in the Philippines, the northern portion, the topmost island of the Philippines, where the Moros are trying to break away. And this is because they're a group of people who has very little in common with the rest of the Filipinos. Well, eventually, the Moros are going to be given home rule of their own area. And that's a good thing. That's, at least progress in that area. But it's not complete independence. And a group called Abu Sayyaf, which is going to be a terrorist organization in Southeast Asia, is going to start acting for the Moro separatists in very violent fashions. And the United States is going to become very interested in what's going on because these Moro separatists are going to start creating a lot of unrest in the area, and it starts to affect not only just the Filipino people, but really anyone in Southeast Asia. And this begins in the 1970s and really progresses up into the present day today. And even the current president of the Philippines, Gloria Arroyo, is still trying to deal with Abu Sayyaf in this area. And here's just an example of some of the different things that they have done recently. They have, in 2007, abducted a bunch of workers, cut their heads off. All the way back in 1995, they took 30 people hostage, and 53 civilians and soldiers were killed by Abu Sayyaf. So there's a variety of different situations that they've had to deal with, and this organization keeps pushing more violent methods across the table. And it's resulting into a fear that maybe this is an area the United States needs to get involved in. And that's a great question. Should we be involved in a terrorist organization outside of the United States so far away in Southeast Asia? I don't know. Kind of up to your own opinion to determine that yourself. Well, outside of this area, we're also going to talk about Myanmar. And Myanmar is going to be a little bit of a different story. This is formerly known as Burma. This area is going to be extraordinarily repressive throughout this time, because if we look at the countries that are very near Myanmar, we're looking at countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and China, places where democracy isn't exactly a commonplace thing. In fact, military governments pretty much dominate all of these areas. And we're going to have a lot of influence from, small communist organizations within there. And Burma is just going to be a trouble spot from their beginning at the end of World War II. Well, during this story, we're going to get a really interesting story of a ruler who really doesn't really want to ever back down, and her name's Aung San Suu Kyi. And she is going to be one of the most inspirational leaders in world history, really anytime during the 20th century or modern day at all. What ends up happening is her dad is a leader of Myanmar, and he is actually arrested and killed for speaking out against the repressive military government. When this happens, Aung San Suu Kyi is going to become a huge outspoken opponent of the government, to the point where eventually she's going to get placed under house arrest for 20 years. And she's going to be stuck, confined to her home, this home, for 20 years of her life. And while she is there, she becomes this huge outspoken person for human rights around the world. In fact, it's actually going to get her a Nobel Peace Prize. Eventually, she gains her own freedom, and when she does, she actually runs for office and becomes a leader of the House of Representatives within Myanmar, and is still constantly trying to push for change in the country, still actively involved in the government today. I believe last time I checked, she was debating as to whether or not she wanted to run for the presidency of the country. But this is happening because the military dictatorship in the country has been strangleholding against any sorts of human rights in the area, but she has constantly had the courage to stand up for what she believes is right and what her father believed was right. And she's become this moral compass for the people of Southeast Asia, trying to constantly speak out for active participation in government. A huge inspirational leader in the modern world, is probably the closest thing to a Gandhi figure that we have had since the death of Gandhi earlier in the century. Next up, we go to Singapore and Malaysia. Now, this is a very simple story. Singapore and Malaysia have an interesting history. When the Japanese left, communism was sweeping across Malaysia. The Malay people want nothing to do with the rest of the people in the area. If you remember from a long time ago, we talked about how Singapore is this weird amalgamation of different groups of people. There's Chinese people, there are Malay, there are Indonesian people, there's Dutch, all of them in this tiny little city. Well, eventually the Malay, having no interest in dealing with Singapore, allows Singapore to just leave. And Singapore is going to become its own country. And this is going to become a huge situation because Singapore is probably the coolest city in all of Asia. It is this perfect mixture of Western and Eastern society, as clean as can be. And I would encourage you guys to go Google what Singapore looks like. It is gorgeous. It is the cleanest city you will ever find. It is so technologically advanced, skyscrapers everywhere, the skyline is beautiful. Yet there's this constant mixture of greenery everywhere too. And it's a wonderful example of what happens when the West meets the East and gets along. So they run away. They become their own country, and that's kind of the end of the story there. Singapore itself, like I said, prospers. It's extraordinarily wealthy. In 2008, they were per person significantly more wealthy than the United States. That trend still exists today, even though these numbers have changed a little bit. The United States GDP per capita is about 50,000. Singapore is about 55,000 per person. But they're an extraordinarily rich country. They are one of the richest countries in the world, despite the fact that they are only the size of an island in a small city civilization. Alright, last on our agenda list is going to be Indonesia. And we've talked about this before, but Indonesia is a monstrously huge country. You don't really get this perspective from this map, but there are thousands upon thousands of islands here. And this is going to be huge because when Indonesia breaks free from the Dutch during World War II, or after World War II, they're going to be placed under the leadership of a really awesome leader, a guy by the name of Sukarno. He is going to liberate the country from the Dutch, but it doesn't last, which is unfortunate. Sukarno and its 14,000 islands and huge number of ethnic groups are eventually going to be overthrown and led by a different ruler, a guy by the name of Suharto, and this is where this gets a little confusing. Sukarno is going to be declared the lifetime president. They loved him, but what he never really dealt with was the financial situation of the country. So this is going to allow a military dictator, a guy by the name of Suharto, to overthrow him. And when this happens, everything falls apart. Suharto is not a pleasant individual. And it's kind of hard to keep these the same, but it's important to remember with Suharto that he is going to repress the rights of anyone who does not see his way. And the biggest example of this is going to be a country called East Timor. And East Timor is tiny. It is a small portion of a single island. But in order to conform them to what he believed was appropriate, he made their religion outlawed. He bribed officials. He did anything he could to disrupt the life of the people of East Timor. And eventually, the people of Indonesia become so upset with him that they force him to leave office after the country just becomes so destitute and poor. But the moral of the story is you have these two different leaders during the time of the Indonesian uprising, the Indonesian freedom, that we get to see two very different perspectives as to leadership in this area. Sukarno is awesome. The people love him. He's beloved by the people and everything that goes. And then you have Suharto, who is viewed as a villain. So the way I always try to figure this out, or at least keep it straight, is that Sukarno is kind and Suharto is hated. So get the K, the kind, the hated Suharto. Well, these two people are going to, really define democracy in Indonesia. After Sukarno's and Suharto's reign, eventually Sukarno's daughter is going to become the new leader of Indonesia back in 2001. Her name is Megawati Sukarno Putri. She is going to encourage Indonesians to accept democracy, and they will. Problem is there's still a lot of problems in Indonesia today. The economy is not great, and there's a lot of corruption that was left behind by Suharto. Well, eventually new leadership comes along, but Indonesia itself is still a thriving country today. It's one of the strongest and fastest growing countries in the area with a very, very large population. On the flip side of that is East Timor, which after Suharto eventually is going to get its independence. But when it does, it officially becomes the poorest nation in the world instantaneously. They are a group of farming people that have very little interest in the acquisition of wealth. And upon their independence, they are going to become an extraordinarily impoverished world in a very modernized East Asia. So, yay, kinda. But you're free, so props to you. Alright, so that is our rundown of things in Southeast Asia. Hopefully you caught everything you need from this, and if you have any questions, let me know next day in class. Thanks, and have a wonderful day, everybody.